Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome once again to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller, along with Mike Hightower and Mike Tolbert, who are both in their remote studios, and we're delighted to have you with us. Of course, Mike's on Mike, always brought to you by the Jacksonville History Center and the fine staff that Dr. Alan Bliss has put together, and the fine donors who keep the lights on and the cameras rolling. Thank you all very much for your generosity and your help. Well, since President Trump's election, and especially during the last month, news and conversations have been dominated about the proposed U.S. takeover of the Panama Canal and the imposition of tariffs by the U.S. on products that are shipped from Mexico, Canada, and China. Locally, Jacksonville port officials and others are watching what's going on and planning for the port's future. As a reminder, by the way, Jaxport provides a global gateway to Florida and is the state's largest container port. It also handles more vehicles than just about any other port in the nation. Our guest today is Robert Peak, Jaxport's Chief Commercial Officer. Robert's worked at Jaxport since 1995 with a series of promotions through the ranks. He became Chief Commercial Officer in 2022. Mike's on Mike wants to know about the potential impact of both the tariffs and the takeover of the Panama Canal on the port, which is why we invited Robert Peak to join us today. Robert, nice to have you with us. Good to see you again.
Mike, good to see you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tolbert, kick it off for us, please.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Robert, thanks for joining us today.
This is my pleasure.
Before we get into tariffs on the canal, I want to ask you about the port. People in Jacksonville buy their electricity every month and their water from JEA. They ride on buses owned by the JTA, and they drive on roads built by the JTA. So I think we think about those two authorities more than we do about the port. I think people consider the port as being some kind of out there somewhere. But the three of us, and you know that's not the case. Tell us, when somebody asks you, Robert, why is the port so damn important to Jacksonville? What makes it important? What do you answer?
Mike, the short answer to that is we consider ourselves Jacksonville's economic engine. And that is that our facilities create jobs for a tremendous number of people in Northeast Florida. In fact, we had an economist recently update our economic impact study, and we found there's about 30,000 jobs in Northeast Florida that what he calls port dependent. And that is, it's not only the direct jobs, the longshore labor, the trucking companies, the warehouse, but all the indirect and spin-off organizations and companies that actually use the port and rely on cargo that flows through the port. And so that's really why we have a port. It's really why we do everything we do, is to create facilities so we have jobs and business opportunities for people throughout Northeast Florida.
Yeah, Robert, again, thanks for joining us. I'm going to put on my old JEA hat here. As you know, I was on the board for 16 years, 4 years inside. I want to ask you about some news that's been in lately about the Jaxport and JEA working together at a cost of $117 million to raise those power lines spanning the St. Johns River so larger cargoes can get through in and out of the port. This hasn't always been smooth sailing between the two authorities, JEA and y'all. Why is that so important? And then the question from my perspective is, how did the port get JEA to agree to go in with some of this $117 million to raise those power lines? And who else is going to, is it just the port and JEA, or is there somebody else that's going to share in that?
Part of that question, Mike, is good questions. So as you know, Jacksonville's port, our harbor was deepened a few years ago in 2022, and that was just a critical project for the continued viability of the port, not only to grow our business, frankly, but to retain a lot of the business that we had captured over the previous 10 years. Because over time, really over for many decades, shipping lines, these global shipping lines that provide all the goods into and out of U.S. ports, including Jacksonville, those ships are getting bigger and bigger, and they're requiring deeper and deeper water in which to operate. So Jacksonville shipping channel was deepened in 2022. It's allowing these larger ships to come in, but those ships are also getting taller and taller. And so those ships are having what's known as an air draft restriction, and that is those shipping lines want to bring us bigger ships, but those ships are too tall to pass beneath the JEA power lines, which span just in front of the Blount Island terminal. So every ship that comes into the Jacksonville's harbor, no matter which facility they're going to a Port Authority facility, they must come beneath those power lines. And so JEA has been a great partner of ours now, working with the port to come up with a plan to raise those power lines. We'll get an extra 30 feet of operational clearance for those ships when that project is done in a couple of years. So that's really, I think that project is critical to really fully maximize the capability of our port, because those international shipping lines and that freight and those businesses want to come here if we can continue to provide the capability for them to bring those ships in.
Would they expand as well? Will the market expand as a result of that? Are there others?
Yeah, so what's happened, Mike, is when we visit with these international shipping lines, they'll often ask us, when are you going to raise those lines? Because they're making decisions about how they're going to deploy these vessels as they get bigger and bigger. And they're looking at ports up and down the east coast of the United States to determine which of you ports have the capability to handle my vessels. And so when we can show them this 47 feet of water, which is, by the way, the same depth as our biggest competitor, the Port of Savannah, and we can show them this really high operational clearance once that project is done, it opens up a whole kind of the whole playbook, if you will, of what's available for us to be able to go out and say, listen, there's a commercial opportunity here for us, and your ships can fit. And so we can, again, retain the business that we've spent so hard, so many years to acquire, but also then grow that over time.
If I can, let me just follow up with one other question. Like you, I was into business development when I was at JEA, which is really what you're doing as a commercial officer. So if I were dealing with the JEA, would they not come back and say, okay, listen, we're going to go ahead and pay whatever portion of that $117 million is needed in order to raise those lines? But our question now is, are we going to be able to share in any of the additional revenue that you're going to get because of those taller lines so that we can offset some of the $117 million and not charge the ratepayers like you and me who are using their electric and water?
Sure, and I don't want to speak for JEA, but I think what Jay has said is that they see the economic importance of the Port Authority, right? And the viability of the port here, the fact that it creates so many jobs, and that they want to be good community partners. So I think they're looking at this broadly and saying, we recognize this is an important project for the community. And so as a community partner, we're going to participate.
I hate to bring it down to such sophomore terms, but does that mean it's going to be a gift and not an investment?
Well, I think it's an investment by the community into the...
Thank you, Michael Millie.
Yeah. I would consider it an investment in the community, by the community into the port, so we can continue to grow the port and all of us reap the economic benefit that is a viable port.
Which could be indirect as much as it could be direct.
Certainly, and there's a lot of both direct and indirect impacts.
2 follow-up questions. Number one, is this a 50-50 split between JEA and the port? That's number one. Number two, the largest cargo ships that are out there now, will that allow the largest cargo ships to come into the port if we raise the extra 30 feet now?
Yes. So the first part of your question is a little outside my sandbox, and I'm the business development guy, so I can better answer the second piece, and that is yes. So the largest cargo ships that come to the East Coast of the United States, they have the capability of carrying about 18,000 containers. That's the maximum that really come into the U.S. East Coast. And yes, so once the power lines are raised, we'll have the physical capability with the harbor depth and the air draft to be able to handle those ships. We think the bread and butter of those ships are going to be somewhere a little bit less than that, maybe 15, 16, 17,000, what we call TEUs, which is 20-foot equivalent container units on a ship. So, and right now, the biggest that can come into the port on any kind of regular basis is around 14,000 containers. And that 14, 15 mark is super critical because a lot of these shipping lines are kind of trying to get to 15, 16, 17. So if you're stuck at 14, then you really are stuck behind the 8 ball in terms of what you really can bring into the port.
So where are those larger ships going now?
So the larger ships can go to like the Port of New York, for example. Norfolk has a lot of big ships, but a lot of the largest cargo ships in the world, they don't even come to the United States. They're going to Asia, Europe, different trade lanes. So you're seeing actually ports up and down the East Coast doing the same thing. They're trying to get their air draft clearance and their water draft to sufficient heights and depths, respectively, to be able to capture this business.
Does that mean, though, that when this thing goes up 30 more feet, and with the 47 that we've gone down into the river, does that make us probably the premier port on the East Coast or in at least the southern part of the coast, for these larger cargo ships?
Yes, it positions ourselves to capture to capture the cargo that we know wants to come to Northeast Florida. So you have other ports doing the same thing. So you have other ports that are trying to, increase their harbor depth or their water depth. But those shipping lines call multiple ports. So those ships are going to say, I'm going to call New York, and I'm going to call Norfolk and Savannah or Charleston and Jacksonville. They're going to call multiple of those ports. And they want to know, of all of you, how many of you can accommodate my vessels? So to accommodate that business, to even be considered for accommodating that business, we have to have, the physical capability to handle those vessels.
I would also think that from a logistics point of view, our land movement is also has a lot of advantages. I mean, you've got I-75, I-95, and I-10 that all converge in Jacksonville, and that's the land you need to take those containers and move them to their destination.
Well, there's another element too that's really playing in our favor, and that is the sheer size of the population of the state of Florida.
Yeah.
So Florida's the third most populous state in the nation now, and and so that's where all the consumers are, and frankly, that's where a lot of the labor is, and that's what a lot of these companies are looking for. They're saying, if I'm going to locate, for example, a facility in a city, do you have the workforce here that we need? And Jacksonville certainly has that. You layer on that the highway connectivity, Interstate 95, which runs north and south in the U.S., intersecting with I-10, runs all the way to California. They intersect at the port of Jacksonville, Florida. And you layer on that all that population base, the workforce, and now the water and height capability for those vessels. Did it answer your question, Mike? Yes. I think it positions us for an argument to be, one of the outstanding options for those carriers.
At the February 6th State of the Port Summit, Port CEO Eric Green said you didn't really have any idea as to what the tariffs were going to be yet or what they might look like, but whatever they are, it won't impact so much the port of Jacksonville. Why is that?
Yes, so there's a couple of reasons. The main reason is that our port is one of the most diversified ports on the East Coast of the United States. And when I talk about diversification, I mean the different countries with which we trade, and also the kinds of cargo that are handled through the port of Jacksonville. So, for example, a lot of the tariffs that have been talked about publicly, they're very focused right now. There's been talk about tariffs with Canada, tariffs with Mexico and China. So those three countries combine from perhaps 15% of our business, for example. So if the tariffs are confined to just a few countries, we trade with so many other countries that we can absorb any kind of indirect impact that might occur from tariffs and not really feel a huge impact from that. Our biggest trading partner is the island of Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is a U.S. Commonwealth, and so there's no direct tariffs between those two. And the other reason is that tariffs are not paid directly to a port. The tariffs don't come to or from directly a port. There's an import tax paid by companies in the U.S. that import those goods, and then if those companies can then decide, well, how do I absorb those tariffs? Do I just eat that cost? They might ask the companies they're sourcing to reduce their upfront costs. They can pass it on downstream, for example, to a consumer. Well, then what does the consumer do? If the consumer continues to buy that product and companies continue to import that same amount of product, then there's no impact to a port. So there's a lot of dominoes that have to fall really before a port feels the impact of tariffs, because they're not paid directly to or from us. And because we're so well diversified, from what's been talked about so far, I think our Port of Jacksonville is probably as well positioned as anyone to handle any impact from tariffs.
What about our competitor ports like Savannah and Charleston? Are they as insulated as Jaxport is, or will they feel the impact?
Yeah, and I haven't done an analysis of those two ports, but they're pretty diverse ports. I mean, they handle a lot of different kinds of cargo. So I think for any port to feel significant impact, there would have to be global tariffs. They would have to be high, and they'd have to be pervasive, and which is always possible. So, but again, from what's been discussed so far publicly, I think that our port can absorb those and we'll be okay.
just historically speaking, you may remember that the United States actually built the Panama Canal in early part of the 20th century, and then control was turned over to Panama during the Jimmy Carter administration in 1999. Once again, though, it appears that port officials are saying that the control of the canal probably won't impact Jaxport like it might other U.S. cities. Why are we so insulated from that? Explain the port's relationship with India, too, which is important, and what ports will be doing will most impact in the U.S. taking control. Will Savannah, for instance, be affected?
So, Mike, just to give you some numbers, so there about 40% of all the shipping containers that come into and out of the United States pass through the Panama Canal. But at the port of Jacksonville, that number is probably closer to 15% or so. We do handle some automobiles as well that pass through the Panama Canal. So again, getting back to this idea of business diversification, we have goods that pass through the Suez Canal. We have goods that pass through the Panama Canal. We have goods that don't use a canal at all. So the Caribbean is a big market of ours. Europe is a big emerging market of ours. So those vessels don't come through a canal in those examples.
We're a big importer of aluminum and steel from Canada. Does Canada use our port for those exports?
No, in fact, our port doesn't really handle aluminum and steel. We can and we have in the past, but those are commodities. Sometimes they come, sometimes they go. But for example, last year we handled virtually no steel or aluminum. So a lot of that cargo, might move by inland, by truck or whatnot. Yeah.
With everything going on with the talk of tariffs in the Panama Canal, what I'm hearing is with the tariffs, what we're talking about is 15% out of 100%. And because of the diversification, number one, we're diversified enough that we can absorb that down the road. That's number one. Number two is with the other issues just popped up about aluminum and steel. What I think I heard you say is that's not one of the things that come through our port. So for the record, I just wanted to make sure that we had that for the record.
Sure, yes, sir. So there's three different points there. One is the aluminum and steel. We don't really handle aluminum and steel or much at all. So the new tariffs on aluminum and steel won't really impact the Port of Jacksonville directly because we don't really handle that as a raw material. The 15% or so, now that's about the amount of goods that pass through the Panama Canal. So from a tariffs, and that's separate from the tariff issue. The tariff issue, for example, the president has imposed 10% tariffs on goods imported from China. Well, China's maybe 10% of our shipping volume. So, and tariffs don't automatically reduce that volume. It just means that the cost of those taxes go up. So, from an impact standpoint, a 10% impact on China, I don't think is going to have a measurable impact on the Port of Jacksonville. Now, if there were more pervasive tariffs, that were large tariffs on more countries, the more that is added on, the more likelihood it is that you'll eventually see an impact.
Okay. Getting back to seriously, one of the serious questions that we had here was, we are not the only port in Florida. And my understanding was, or over the past, because we have multiple ports, the state of Florida is different from either Georgia or South Carolina, where they get some sort of a subsidy. Are we getting any subsidy from the state of Florida? And since we don't, how does that compare to Savannah or Charleston?
Yes, so it's a great question. So where the state does invest into its ports, including Jacksonville, is on capital projects. So if we wanted to, when we deepened the shipping channel, the state participated in that. They paid about 25% of that. When we buy a big ship-to-shore container crane, those cranes are now $15 million or more a piece. So the state helps us with that. When we want to rebuild a ship berth, the state would help us with that. So the state will help us with specific capital projects. And the state's been very, very supportive of us. Where the difference between
us helping to raise the power lines?
Oh, I don't know. And again, the whole funding of the power lines thing is a little outside my sandbox. So I don't know. But again, typically on a capital project, often the state will help us. But the difference between us and, for example, the Port of Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, is those are state-run ports authorities. Florida has 15 ports. They're all individually run. And those states tend to heavily financially incentivize companies to come locate in and around their ports. They heavily incentivize, in the past, their import distribution centers, big retailers. They incentivize manufacturing. And these huge, huge numbers that they give these companies, extremely large financial incentives. And the state and the city we really rely more on our logistics advantages, our state population, our workforce, some of these other advantages we have versus just writing a check and financially incentivizing companies to come to our state.
Getting back to the dredging for just a couple of moments, I think many of us remember that there was quite a discussion going on between the Riverkeeper and the Jaxport at the time when that dredging was going on. And as we mentioned before, the dredging actually went to 47 feet. Tell us, has that proven to be as successful as you hoped it would be when you started the project? In other words, are we seeing more traffic as a result of that? And if so, how much?
Yeah, so Mike, for me personally, it's been far more successful in a shorter period of time than I ever thought it would be.
Really?
Yeah, and for a couple of reasons for that. So remember, one of the key reasons we wanted to do the deepening project is we wanted to retain the existing business we had now. That we had shipping lines tell us, we're going to be making the ships bigger. If you can't handle it, we're gonna move all that business, all those ships out of Jacksonville. So this was not a case where, so they were bringing us like ships that could carry 10,000 containers, for example, okay? And they were going to upgrade those ships to carry 14,000 containers. So this was not a case where we would just keep the 10,000 container ships. They were going to say, can you handle the 14s? If you can, we'll bring you those. If you can't, we might just leave Jacksonville altogether. So it was a case, can you handle the 14s or you get none? And in that specific case, they upsized those vessels. Instead of carrying 10,000 containers, they now carry up to 14,000 containers, and they come to the port of Jacksonville every week. In fact, I thought it would take maybe a year after harbor deepening. Well, within 30 days, they upsized those vessels for us. And we've gotten several new big global shipping services come to Jacksonville since the harbor deepening. You touched on one briefly, and that's with India. Yeah, so India is now about the biggest country in the world, and we've never had direct container shipping service between India and the port of Jacksonville until this last year, where one of the world's biggest shipping lines started a service from India and Pakistan that comes to the east coast of the United States, and they stop at the port of Jacksonville. They pick up cargo and drop off cargo here. That's a trade lane we've never had before, and we would not have without the harbor deepening project.
Okay. Let me throw one question politically in there, if I may. In many respects, the state of Florida is very fortunate with this new administration. You've got our former U.S. Senator who is now the Secretary of State. You've got Susie Wiles, who's the Chief of Staff. You have the President of the United States, who is now actually a Florida resident. I understand he takes homestead exemption for Mar-a-Lago or something like that. But with all of that influence in Washington, all coming from Florida, are you guys popping champagne corks in your conference rooms as a result of what business you might be able to gain as a result of that kind of influence?
I do think, Mike, it's helpful that you have people that are so familiar and supportive of Florida, in those positions. I will say this, and because the port it is by nature, it tries to be an apolitical animal, but
of course,
the truth is, even very, very candidly, we've been super fortunate as a port in that the local government officials on both sides of the aisle and statewide and federally have recognized the importance of Jacksonville's port. And we've received a tremendous amount of support from both Republicans and Democrats, elected officials for many, many years in the port of Jacksonville. And I saw a quote years ago that talked about a bridge and said there's no Republican bridges or Democratic bridges, just a bridge. And I think ports are kind of the same way. So the short answer is yes, it's great to have people who can make decisions and have the ability to help Florida in those positions. We've been very fortunate over the years that whoever those people are, they usually have seen the value of the port and been willing to invest in it.
And I think we've also seen probably evidence both in Washington and Tallahassee where if it has something to do with something like a port, you'll get bipartisanship on that because everyone is looking for the best for the state and not a question of who can be on the upper hand as far politically.
Well, also because, again, we go back to our mission. Our state's mission is to be an economic engine for Northeast Florida and for the state to create jobs and business opportunities for companies. And so everyone fairly much understands the importance of doing that, of creating jobs, good paying jobs, creating a tax base, bringing in investment. And so we've had a lot of support for that.
Yeah, and Robert, before I ask it, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been extremely informative.
Sure has.
And my pleasure. Just chock full of good information, and we appreciate it so much. My final question has two parts. In the 30 years since you've been with the Fort, how has it changed? And then secondly, what do you see for the port in the future? Say, go out 10 or 15 years.
Sure. So when I came to the Port of Jacksonville, we primarily were a port that handled cargo with the island of Puerto Rico, which is still our largest trading partner and still phenomenally important to us. And we did a little bit of trade with Brazil, but almost nowhere else. And we handled a lot of automobiles, and that's who we were. And that was a nice piece of business. But we recognized that we really had this incredible capability in the Port of Jacksonville, and that we wanted to capitalize on that. And again, to create this opportunity for citizens in Northeast Florida and throughout the state. And so, Mike, the short answer is we've seen this port grow in its capability. We now trade with 70 countries around the world. I think there's 140 ports we connect with. We trade with every country, every continent except Antarctica. We have business. We're the 10th largest container port in the United States. We're the third busiest vehicle handling port in the United States. We're the biggest container port in Florida. We're the busiest container port. The busiest port for all cargo types with the island of Puerto Rico. So we've gone from kind of this smaller, kind of quieter, smaller purpose port to really being a global player. And that's been by design. And in terms of moving forward, Mike, we want to continue to be a well-diversified port. We want to have a lot of trade with lots of countries. And almost everything under the sun moves through our port. We move cargo containers, we move automobiles, we move raw materials, we move forest products, we move dry bulk aggregates, we move liquid bulk. We have a cruise business, a burgeoning cruise business. And so all of those things provide a well-diversified portfolio for us. So when there's any kind of event, whether it's trade policy, a natural disaster, a war, a terrorism event, if it's in one part of the world, that we in Jacksonville, we can absorb that best because we have so much business elsewhere. And so, Mike, I think you're going to continue to see a growing and well-diversified port, a bigger port with more business, more jobs, more diversified in the next 10 years.
Great. Robert, thank you so very, very much for being with us. We really, really enjoyed it.
Very, very informative.
It was. Now, next week, our guest is going to be former Jacksonville Mayor John Payton. Among other things, we want to talk to Mayor Payton about what's going on currently politically, both in Washington as well as Tallahassee and in Jacksonville. And we'll get his take on many of the items that are still up for discussion. Thank you all for joining us once again. Our thanks to the Jacksonville History Center for their sponsorship. And we hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of Mike's on Mike. Take care.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.